Okay, so we want to actually start pulling inputs, but we know that we want it to do a lot more. So I'm actually going to put this in my helpers. I want, I'm just going to call it game input, but basically I want this to take in all types of input that we're receiving from the player as they're playing it. Now the game input is going to have to implement, we need something that's going to measure for gesture detection, and that's actually called gesture detector dot gesture listener. That's an interface that we're going to be using. So we need to actually roll those in. We want to implement those methods. We're going to do all of them. Okay, so let's look at what we got. We have touchdowns, we have taps, we have long press, we have fling. That's where you're clicking and dragging in a direction. We have pan, where you are, instead of starting with the movement, you are tapping somewhere and then moving. We have pan stop. So these methods, if you are panning, you can set it up so that once you stop, that it's capturing that X and Y value, you could use it. Zoom, pinch, where you're using two fingers and you can pinch. So we have quite a bit of methods that we could play with. This tap, I have it as a lot of different movements in mind because I can capture the location and I can capture how many times it has been tapped. So if I'm trying to do a double tap or a single tap, that can be here. Long press is just holding it, and I could set the duration to capture that input. So for our game input, if we want to have everything in terms of our screen, this is where we have to pass in the viewport. So I'm going to do Alt Insert. I need to build a constructor, a custom constructor. I'm going to need to have my viewport, and I'm going to need to have my camera. So I can go private orthographic camera, let's call camera, private viewport, and we can call this game viewport. Import that in. And then in here, I can actually get the camera from the viewport. We've seen it where it said get camera, so I'm going to just pass in a viewport. So instead of passing in, say, fit viewport, I pass in viewport. Then if I make changes to what the viewport is, it's not going to ruin my game. Viewport. Build that in. So this dot game viewport is equal to game viewport. And then I want to get that camera. So camera is going to be assigned from the game viewport dot get camera. And now I have my camera, but I need to cast it. So I know it's an orthographic camera. The computer doesn't. So I have to pass that in and cast it as an orthographic camera. And errors went away. Bob's your uncle. Okay, so we could deal with, depending on if they were playing the game on, say, a desktop or not, our game viewport, we could check those pieces for our game. But let's start plugging in stuff for capturing. Let's just do for a single tap. So if Now I'm going to use the count. So if they only tapped once, if count is equal to 1, then I want to capture that touch. So that X right there is where they tapped on the screen. I need to have it in terms of my world. So I need to actually on-project that touch. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, now this, so if I click it, if I do game viewport, just so we can see dot on project, so that's on projecting off the screen and putting it in terms of my world coordinates. If I look at this, so if I click on it, what is it? Alt. Hold on. Now I'm having fun. Okay, so if I go into that viewport class and start looking at it, let's look at the on project. It takes the screen coordinates, it's putting it in a temporary vector with 3 directions, so X, Y, and Z, and then it's going to actually change that to my world width and world height, and then return it back. So I need, when I pass this in, if I'm using vector 2, I only have to have my X and Y. If it's using vector 3, or vector 3 was passed in, excuse me, let me find it, right there, then it's going to actually be taking a lot more. The screen coordinates, screen X, screen Y, the screen width, and the screen height. And it's going to do a little bit more. So this says that it transforms the specified screen coordinate to world coordinates. The vector that was passed is transformed to world coordinates. All of these are basically doing the same thing. It kind of depends on how I'm passing the information. I found, though, that I get better touch coordinates when I actually pass in a vector 3 as opposed to a vector 2. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to here initialize basically a temporary vector 3 that I'm going to use. So let's just call this private vector 3, and I'll just call it touch. Okay, and then when I am using the constructor, that's when I will initialize new vector 3, and if I just type vector 3 dot 0, it'll give me a vector that's of just 0, 0, 0. Okay, now I could create that down there, create a new one, but then every time a tap happens, I am creating another vector 3. I'm holding that memory for it. It's a waste of memory. I want to kind of optimize things. So in this case, I have only one touch point that is going to get changed. So I can reinitialize that touch. So I could say touch.x is going to be assigned whatever that x value is. Touch.y is going to be assigned whatever that y value where they touched was. Okay. Now when I am passing in this on project, I'm going to pass in those touch coordinates. Okay, and then depending on how you want to deal with it, I have mine where it's just actually locking to like a whole number. I don't need it to be exact where it's I'm at, you know, pixel 23.5876. I could just say I'm at pixel 23, or, you know, in terms of my screen coordinates. And then when it converts that to my world coordinates, I just can have it lock in. So I could say touch.set and then I can set. So here I'm going to use my math utils, and I can just lock it to the floor. So it's just going to round it down. Floor, and then I can pass in that touch.x. So that's doing that for my x. Let's do it for my y. Math utils dot floor, and this would be my touch.y, and then I don't have anything for my z, so I can leave that at 0, and there we go. Okay, so now I'm capturing that. In this case, I would be returning true because I am dealing with that input. If I didn't deal with that tap, then I would return false. So this would be return true. Okay, now we are going to eventually put a lot more pieces in there for what that's going to look like when we're starting to put Ashley. But that would be enough that we can start getting going. Okay, so now that I have some basic pieces for my game input, if I go back to my main game screen, I know I need to set that up to run. So I have to go and set up the game input. So here, controls, and I'm going to do a private game input. That's the name of my class, game input, and I'm going to need to initialize it when the game starts, which would be basically just game input is a new game input that requires that viewport. Okay, now that should be all the pieces that we would need. This we can eventually move or take out, but while we're debugging, it's fine to have it in there for now. So then in our render, just like what we had with the move player, we're going to need to have where we're taking that input and we're dealing with it. But since we're going to be implementing Ashley, we're going to go ahead and hold off a little bit before we put that in. All right, so until the next video where we're going to start doing the pieces for Ashley.